The phantasm is the projected enemy. This idea that you project all your feelings of hatred and destruction are projected outward into a figure that might be real or might not be real. And that figure, it needs to be destroyed. It's not just something that you sort of manage or something, that your politics then consists in defending the phantom possession against an enemy that has to be destroyed.
All over the world, authoritarian and fascist movements are gaining in popularity. These movements often claim that there are outside forces trying to take something away from ordinary people, something that has to be protected against a specific enemy. Within these narratives, there is usually a specific idea of ownership, the feeling that something rightfully belongs to a certain group. But what if people are defending forms of power, status, or control that they never actually fully possessed in the first place? And furthermore, what if the very idea of ownership and control behind these narratives is itself fundamentally flawed? Today's guest, Eva von Redecker, calls this fictional form of ownership phantom possession. She argues that understanding this concept is central to understanding the appeal of authoritarian and fascist politics today. So, to understand this idea better, let's turn to Eva von Redecker.
Hi, I'm Eva von Redecker. I'm a philosopher, critical theorist, and a nonfiction author. So I think one question we're all grappling with in critical theory is how to name and then hopefully also understand and analyze our current political conjuncture. And one debate is whether we're dealing with authoritarianism or fascism, and also how closely this is linked to the preceding neoliberal era, which also requires that any update of our terminology takes into account that if we say it's fascism again, it's a fascism after or even in continuation of neoliberalism. And for me, one concept that does a lot of analytic work at this conjuncture is the concept of phantom possession. And maybe I say a bit about what I mean by that. So phantom possession, you could say it's another word for what somebody like Kate Mann would just call entitlement, or a lot of left sort of activist theory calls privilege, not a concept I find particularly helpful. Phantom possession obviously adds some syllables, so you better justify why you need a more complicated word. And I think we need that more complicated word because it captures the form that ideology takes at present, also sort of its embodied form, but it also provides, well, theory, perhaps even something like explanation for what's happening. So that's the idea. One other achievement, hopefully, of that term is that it does speak to the present moment, or that it allows us to grasp what's going on. So maybe, therefore, I start with some sort of glimpses at the political moments, and then I go deeper into the theory behind it. There's this analysis by Wendy Brown, who I think was one of the first and most clear-sighted analysts of the transition from neoliberalism to authoritarianism, or what she called apocalyptic authoritarianism. And she said, very rightly, as a political observer, if you want to understand why people vote for Trump, don't think it's just one thing. It's got to be several things. So she says, that's already 10 years back now, that there is different types of voters. So there is the anxious kind of person who's looking for protection and thinks something is sort of this threatening them. Then there's the more bullying, kind of more aggressively aggrieved, sort of troll-like type. And then there is the more classic type of Republican who just thinks things have gone wrong, but hopefully somebody can set the course right again. And that would be like the frustrated hopeful, she calls it. And something that strikes me in this phenomenology that carefully pries apart three different aspects, namely that in a way, all those three figures really are owners. The first is trying to defend her crumbling property or see it defended by institutions, by a state, by a strongman, perhaps even. The second has already switched gears into violent self-defense, is kind of trying to use violence, which, of course, in our political imaginary is justified when it comes to your own property. You may resort to self-defense. So that would be the second part. And the third is more somebody who sees that sort of what he sees as his rightful domain is not treated well, and it needs to be, it needs to be amended, maintained, perhaps repaired in some way, for things to be set on course and sort of people to be put outside who don't belong there. And it's striking, I think, that the subjectivity of the owner is so much at the forefront of an analysis of subjectivity, as it were, after neoliberalism or after the entrepreneurial subject. You could say that's the mode in which the failure of the entrepreneurial subject, kind of the subject that didn't manage to make themselves successfully into capital and kind of benefit from all the new circulation and all the new enhanced competitiveness, that they resort to another form, one could say a regressive form of the kind of classic subject of liberalism, the owner, the sovereign proprietor of her or himself, except that it's a weird ownership because it's not of the self. And it's definitely not about material things. I mean, that's what we would love to see on the left, right? Having a discussion about who owns what and whether that's correctly distributed. But something forecloses to even address that kind of social question while still using this vocabulary of property, still all the time speaking in the grammar of entitlement, control, exclusion of others, and also always in this voice of a bereaved, like somebody who's been wronged, who's had something taken away from them. And if you look closely at right-wing claims, you see it in a lot of the areas. So, I mean, the stolen elections are a typical point of there's just this fantasy that something should belong to you that doesn't anymore. We see it now very recently in sort of Trump's new escalation of imperial grasp, first over Venezuela, now with this whole talk about annexing Greenland. And he said in an interview that no, he doesn't just want some trade treaties, and he doesn't even want to have some kind of contractual rights to have access to certain parts of the land. He needs ownership. And he says, interestingly, psychologically, ownership is important, he says, for success. He says it gives you something that you can't do just with contracts or rights. And it really points to the thing that has been now for a long time at the core of my theorizing, the specificity of the modern form of property that is co-extensive with capitalism, that was weaponized already in colonialism, and that I would say underlies all or mediates, we might even say, all forms of social domination. So, of course, patriarchy, the sort of oppression of women by men, is something that, depending on how you count it, might have gone on for 6,000 years. It's not created with capitalism, but it's been recreated or given a new form. And I think the specific aspect of that form is that a particular part of the woman's life, so to say, that is her, we say in theory, reproductive capacity. So that's not just her possibility to give birth, that as well, but also the capacity to care, to look after others, to some parts of her labor activity, and the access to her sexually, that is made into something that is transferable property, that in a kind of typical 18th, 19th century marriage contract under coverture is really parceled up as property and sort of changes hands to the husband, not the right over the woman as a whole person. So that's what we have in chattel slavery, when really the whole body and the personhood of somebody becomes propertized and then also commodified, even financialized. But also in patriarchy, there's an aspect of the woman's life that can be dominated because it is propertized. So what is kind of the ultimate effect of this propertization is that you don't just have a relation of control, but one of abuse, because the specificity of modern property is the fact that it gives total dominion or total right to volition over a certain domain. Of course, it's always limited by the claims of other owners, but where you're the sole owner, it's kind of what Trump means by there's something you can do with ownership, and not if it's really yours, you may also destroy it. And that seems harmless when it comes to water glasses, but when it comes to something that is not actually a thing, that's been made a thing through the property form, it's even true for land, actually. Domination of nature makes nature is made destructible by domination because our domination of nature is shaped by modern property as this relation of total control and right to abuse. So if we say that's the sort of history, the social history that we come from, that our identities were shaped in, and which fortunately we've partially left behind, right? So we would say, well, but that's not how marriage contracts function anymore, not at all. And also, we have at least legally abolished slavery, if not in fact, but at least no one kind of stands up and defends an institution that holds property over another human's whole life. But I think, given that those institutions have really come to define what it means to be male, female, white, non-white, they have an afterlife. They are embodied as differential dispositions. So, in a way, gender is a differential disposition to appropriate care work and sexuality, or to be thus appropriated. So you can have phantom possession, and it's your feeling of entitlement, but it's not just some random entitlement. It's a specific entitlement over the body, over the attentiveness of people gendered female. And same with white supremacy. It's this disposition to appropriate the lives, the labor, but even the whereabouts of people who are racialized. So it's what we see also in the horrific border regimes and the calls for deportation. It's a reification that treats people as if they're kind of things that you may sort differently, put somewhere in a camp as if it were on a shelf. So this whole idea that somebody gets to define of a neighborhood who may be there, and that somebody is then the subject of whiteness, follows a property logic, even still today. But it's not a property logic that is backed up by a legal institution. It's backed up by the sort of embodied dispositions that come from past dominion. And I think it functions as a compensation for some people, for more privileged people, for the losses and the precarity that a capitalist, competition-driven and also thoroughly kind of unsafe and unsolidaristic, atomized form of life presents us with. So, in a way, phantom possession, I would say, is the form of modern ideologies, and it allows a kind of transfer where some of the powerful but propertyless are compensated at the expense of the powerless. And it's kind of the formidable tool to split the oppressed classes, have differential privileges amongst them. And of course, it's always a kind of additional bonus and triumph for those who are already on top. There's no end to feeling that you might need yet a bit more compensation, like even if already you're very propertied, there's this kind of the sky is the limit or not if you get to Elon Musk and Mars. So to grasp this afterlife of property that is not institutionalized dominion, but it is still a relation structured by property logics, I use this term phantom possession. And possession means it's not, so property is the institutionalized form. Possession is whatever I hold. So that says it's free floating. It's just held in the identities and the bodies of the people who are subjectivated in those regimes. So possession, not property, and phantom, not real, because it's actually gone. It's not you're not allowed to rape a woman. Nevertheless, the kind of right-wing masculinists we in America now, Nick Fuentes brought it up, have this slogan, "Your body, my choice." So there is exactly this kind of property claim, but it's the kind of echo of something that's already removed. And I don't mean phantom in the sense of ghost, I mean phantom in the sense of phantom limb. So there is an empty place where something used to be. So there used to be a sphere that you can control if you're set and thus entitled. And now there is nothing, but you still feel the urge to control. It's kind of as if, as if it still itches and you still, in a way, precisely need to draw objects there or stage a much more explosive form of violence, as it were, almost in the void, definitely not backed up by any legal claim, because that might, for one fleeting moment, at least performatively, re back up your property claim. Like, it's as if I really show I can destroy that woman, then I retroactively prove she was mine. And that's how this hard to grasp situation can be explained, that we have, especially when we have progressive legislation for greater protection of women against violence, or when women gain new rights, usually the femicide rates go up as well. I mean, that's not an argument, obviously, against emancipation. It just shows how difficult emancipation is, especially if it happens within that logic of self ownership, where what the woman gets is not kind of partaking in a free and solidaristic society of like mutually need fulfilling creatures, but where she now too is a self-owning individual. And it's very hard to even ever feel that you properly are a self-owning individual. So such a temptation to play it out on outer spheres. And that's what phantom possession does for some.
So, as Redecker argues, phantom possession creates the fiction of a total right to control or domination over something. Even though these forms of entitlement are not based on actual legal ownership, they still follow a logic of property and possession. People come to experience themselves as entitled to these imagined forms of ownership. According to Redecker, this helps explain the appeal of authoritarian and fascist politics, because these movements draw on feelings of threatened or lost possession and are able to mobilize them politically.
And so to come back to this question I started with what do we call the whole formation, I actually think that phantom possession allows us to differentiate certain sort of, as it were, stages of right-wing politics or development. So I would say those policies that we see that aim to shore up, as it were, the first type of Brown, the kind of protection seeking that builds walls and promises to protect families and whatever, that is typical authoritarianism. Authoritarianism at present is the defense of phantom possession, by sort of strengthening its infrastructures, by a lot of symbolic absurdities that don't do anything. But for instance, in Germany, we have all this debate about the German language not being kind of made ugly by gender justice, grammar, like those kind of things. And then you have a sort of additional escalation of the property form in the type of politics that I would call fully fascist. And that are those that defend phantom possession, not just in a protective way. Even, I mean, that often also has victims already, but in an sort of outspoken, frenzied type of self-defense that actually has an enemy. So where there is a phantasm as well as a phantom, as it were. So you might also have heard that term. I mean, it comes up in the work of Sally Haslanger, but definitely Judith Butler has used it a lot, both to speak about racism, but especially to speak about transphobia. So the phantasm is the projected enemy. In critical theory, of course, we know it from Adorno's pathic projection, right? This idea that you project all your feelings of hatred and destruction are projected outward into a figure that, might be real or might not be real. And that figure, it needs to be destroyed. It's not just something that you sort of manage or something, that your politics then consists in defending the phantom possession against an enemy that has to be destroyed. So I would say a full fascist logic is three-partite. It has the subject as an owning subject, except that it's phantom possession. That would be the object. And then it has the object, so the other that is not there to be kind of husbanded, but to be hunted or to be just punished, killed in this constantly imagined state of emergency that fascism resorts to justify its own emergence. I mean, that they always think the order is already crumbling and therefore now you need to defend your own. And, as in the ICE advert, your home will be yours again. It's just, of course, it is a neo-Nazi chant. I mean, that's the idea. The country is imagined as a property that belongs to some, not to others, and those others are treated as something that just has to be cleansed away. So that's how I would use the concept of phantom possession to define authoritarianism and then also fascism as liquidating defense of phantom possession.